Jerry Lee Lewis was the kind of rock star whose reputation seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of mere show business. If you can imagine the rawest, most unfiltered version of 1950s rock and roll rebellion, piano legs threatening to snap under a barrage of frenzied key pounding, microphone stands teetering on the brink of toppling, and a voice that could outshout any riot, that was Jerry Lee. Born in 1935, he crawled out of a poor corner of Faraday, Louisiana, into a world he was determined to set on fire. Maybe it was that small-town hunger propelling him, or maybe it was something inherent in his very being. But from the time he could form conscious thoughts, young Jerry Lee had music. He had it in the shape of an old upright piano that his parents, Elmo and Mamie, mortgaged part of their farm to buy, in the gospel hymns that reverberated through their local churches, in the boogie-woogie tunes he overheard from seedy juke joints he wasn't supposed to visit. There was an irrepressible energy radiating from him, a sense that the moment he touched a keyboard, sparks would fly. He was only 3 when tragedy first reached into his life. His older brother died after being struck by a drunk driver. Even at such a young age, Jerry Lee seemed to wrap pain in layers of boldness. He used that heartbreak as a fuel source, a constant undercurrent that might have blurred the line between living recklessly and living ferociously. As he got older, he found himself pulled between the straight-laced religious expectations of his family and the enticing world of after-hours joints. His father's hopes that he'd remain firmly in the fold of gospel music collided with Jerry Lee's increasing fascination with up-tempo, raucous rhythms. The outcome was a rebellious teenage Jerry Lee, banging out a gospel tune so frantically that his religious teachers kicked him out of school. Rock and roll was never known for politely coloring inside the lines, and neither was Jerry Lee. Eventually, he and his parents realized that if there was any modern mecca for the unbridled style of music he craved, it had to be Memphis. That was where Sun Records, Sam Phillips's famous studio, had transformed Elvis Presley into a national obsession. The Lewis family's determination trumped any notion of practicality. Elmo sold eggs by the dozen, 33 of them, to pay for the gas and supplies they needed just to get their boy in front of Sam Phillips. This was the same Sam Phillips who had discovered the likes of Elvis, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins, and he was always on the hunt for something raw and dangerous. Jerry Lee, with his unhinged piano style, certainly fit the bill. Even if his first single didn't catch on, the second one, Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On, lit up the airwaves like a flare in the night sky. It announced to the nation in no uncertain terms that a wild new talent had arrived. Someone both mesmerizing and menacing. Someone whose personal life would soon prove to be as reckless as his stage presence. The roots of that recklessness ran deeper than the music, all the way into his day-to-day choices. Legend has it that driving a Buick at breakneck speed, Jerry Lee once slammed into a horse. In a feat of near superhuman luck, he survived unscathed. The car might have been totaled and the horse's fate was grim, but Jerry Lee walked away as if the rules of mortality simply didn't apply to him. Stories like that spread quickly, feeding his growing myth. This was a man who might plow through any obstacle, be it a horse, a stage prop, or a social taboo, and carry on as if nothing had happened. And for a little while, the public adored him all the more for this fearlessness. He was the original bad boy of rock, a piano-playing tornado in a time when pianos were supposed to be played demurely. His wiry blonde hair flopped into his face as he shouted and stomped, sometimes even climbing onto the piano itself. People who saw him live came away slack-jawed. There was no telling what he'd do next. If his stage persona were the entire story, Jerry Lee Lewis might simply have been idolized as a figure who pushed the boundaries of 1950s propriety. But there was something more extreme brewing in his personal life, the scandal that would nearly destroy him. In the cultural climate of the late 50s, even the hint of impropriety could sink a celebrity. So when at age 22, Jerry Lee married his 13-year-old cousin, once removed, Myra Gale Brown, the fallout was immediate and violent. He had already been married twice before, once to a preacher's daughter at 16, and then again before that divorce was even finalized. But those details were tame compared to the firestorm unleashed by marrying Myra. Almost overnight, radio stations refused to play his records, and concert venues canceled his gigs. The tabloids had a field day, and the British press, discovering this secret on his arrival for a tour, turned public opinion rabidly against him. He went from commanding $10,000 a show to scrambling to book modest bars and clubs for a mere fraction of that fee. The scandal's impact could have ended a lesser figure's career forever, especially since the mainstream American audience was less forgiving about underage marriage than they were about the rebellious side of rock music. But Jerry Lee, ever stubborn and driven, clung to the stage no matter how small or dingy it might be. The shift from adoring fans in grand theaters to playing in backwater roadhouses might have crushed his pride, but it didn't dent his ferocity. In fact, his mania only seemed to intensify, as if spitting in the face of those who declared his career finished. He kept blazing through show after show, feeding off that rebellious streak. And just as he was recovering some semblance of normalcy, tragedy struck again in his private life. 2 of his sons died in separate accidents. A toddler drowned in the family swimming pool, and years later a teenage son was killed in a Jeep rollover. The weight of these losses, piled on top of a scandal that had already blackened his name, drove Jerry Lee into a vortex of sorrow that he attempted to numb with booze, pills, and destructive behavior. His unpredictability sometimes erupted in near-deadly ways. In the mid-1970s, during a meltdown in his bedroom, he fired a .357 Magnum, and the bullet ricocheted, hitting his bass player, Butch Owens, square in the chest. Miraculously, Owens survived. For Jerry Lee, survival had become something of a twisted hallmark. No matter the calamity, it always seemed that he emerged battered but unbroken. This pattern repeated in 1981 when, fueled by an abundance of liquor and pills, he suffered a stomach rupture that brought him within inches of death. Doctors performed emergency surgery, and in a moment that stunned everyone, declared he had cheated the Reaper once again. Though rock and roll seemed to have rejected him in the wake of his scandal, a new opportunity arose for him in country music during the late 1960s and 1970s. Suddenly, Jerry Lee Lewis was topping country charts, delivering hits like Another Place, Another Time, forging an uneasy new identity as a country crooner while remaining the killer at heart. He had a reputation for outshining, or at least trying to outshine, anyone on stage with him. The rumor that he once set his piano on fire to upstage Chuck Berry is the stuff of rock myth. Jerry Lee never worked too hard to correct such stories, letting them swirl around him like an unstoppable legend. He was also known for crossing paths with icons like Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins in the famous $1 Million Quartet jam session. By the 21st century, he found himself the only survivor of that quartet, a living relic of an era that shaped modern music more than many realize. His personal life, however, kept spinning with the kind of drama that seemed almost scripted. 7 marriages came and went. One wife drowned in a friend's swimming pool. Another died under suspicious circumstances barely 3 months into their marriage, prompting swirling rumors that never fully quieted. He remarried sometimes before divorces were finalized, resulting in endless legal messes. Then, of course, there were his battles with the IRS, who seized his properties and even tried to take his performance fees right after shows. This never-ending carousel of financial ruin, personal tragedy, and self-sabotage might have ended his career a dozen times over. And yet Jerry Lee always bounced back to pound on the piano a little harder. Eventually, the music industry itself could no longer deny the foundational role he played. In 1986, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted its very first class, including Elvis, Chuck Berry, and Jerry Lee Lewis. There was no question he belonged there. His primal pounding piano style was the blueprint for countless rock acts, and his stage presence, part mania, part magnetism, had inspired generations of performers from every corner of the music spectrum. By that time, he had also tried the patience of the Grand Ole Opry, delivering a rambling, profanity-laced set that turned a typical 8-minute appearance into a 40-minute spectacle. More rock than country, more chaos than calm. Jerry Lee would not be invited back, but he continued to appear at other high-profile venues. A guaranteed source of unpredictability. He had equally chaotic episodes around Elvis Presley's home, Graceland. In 1976, apparently drunk, he showed up demanding to see Elvis, only to be turned away because the king was asleep. Minutes later, Jerry Lee crashed his Rolls-Royce and ended up with DWI charges. Barely a day later, he returned to Graceland in a Lincoln Continental, this time with a loaded pistol, and rammed the gates, causing Elvis, watching via security cameras, to exclaim to his guards, "Lock him up." Rock and roll has plenty of wild tales, but few can match the raw, unfiltered madness of Jerry Lee's run-ins with authority and near constant volatility. His appetite for the bizarre extended to how he would spend time unwinding. Some visitors to his home recalled him standing in the kitchen, throwing knives at cabinet doors with an unnerving casualness. Like so many things in Jerry Lee's life, it straddled the line between comedic spectacle and dangerous outburst. Meanwhile, behind the showmanship and shocking stories, there was a man haunted by the moral implications of rock. He had grown up in a devout environment, and the guilt over the supposed devil's music gnawed at him. Interviews in his later years revealed that he worried about his salvation, praying fervently that God would accept him despite the nature of his music and lifestyle. Throughout the 1980s, new tragedies piled on. One wife drowned in a swimming pool, another died in questionable circumstances, and no matter the coroner's verdict, rumors persisted that something more sinister might have been at play. Jerry Lee marched on, convalescing from each blow by burying himself in more whiskey, more pills, or more marriages. In 1981, his stomach lining tore once again, nearly killing him. Somehow the man endured. Part of what enabled him to keep going was help from well-connected fans, like billionaire Steve Bing, who helped fund Jerry Lee's medical bills and orchestrated a triumphant comeback record in the early 2000s. That album, called Last Man Standing, was a star-studded affair, featuring everyone from Mick Jagger to Keith Richards to Eric Clapton, a testament not only to Jerry Lee's ongoing appeal, but also to the widespread respect for his legacy as one of rock's grand architects. The title of the album was more than just a catchy phrase. It was a nod to the reality that Jerry Lee, by that point in time, was quite literally the last man standing from the original crew of Sun Records sensations. He would continue to surprise everyone. In 2019, at age 84, he suffered a severe stroke that cost him the use of his right hand. Devastated, he believed his piano-playing days were finally over. But in a story that sounded almost too good to be true, he experienced a partial recovery within a year. While recording some gospel tunes, he discovered that he could coax movement out of that hand. The moment reportedly brought him to tears of gratitude, an emotional testimony that for all of his life's storms, music remained his constant lifeline. Meanwhile, family drama never ceased to swirl. He married Judith Brown in 2012. She was the former wife of a cousin to Myra Gale Brown, the infamous teenage bride. This union led to friction with his daughter Phoebe, who had served as his manager. He fired her, revoked her power of attorney, and replaced her with Judith. Lawsuits and hostility followed, as they always seemed to in the Lewis family sphere. But Jerry Lee pressed forward, leaning ever more into the notion that he was unstoppable. He left behind a trail of property seizures, bitter court disputes, heartbreak, and near-tragic accidents. No matter where he went, chaos was never too far behind. One of the more surreal anecdotes from his later years came when NASA requested music for Apollo 14 astronauts, apparently believing that Jerry Lee's music might provide comfort to men drifting hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth. An astronaut even wrote him a heartfelt letter, thanking him for bringing a piece of home into the cold vacuum of space. That's the kind of cosmic praise you don't hear about every day, and it underscores the breadth of Jerry Lee's reach. If his private life was a messy tangle of controversies, his music soared high enough to be blasted into orbit. On the subject of controversies, none loomed larger in the public imagination than that marriage to 13-year-old Myra. Over the decades, it receded a bit from the mainstream conversation, overshadowed by newer outrages or by the persistent hush that sometimes falls over uncomfortable histories. Younger fans, discovering his raucous hits for the first time, might not have known the scandal. But among insiders, the memory never truly disappeared, and for many it permanently stained his legacy. Even so, Jerry Lee's defenders pointed to the era's occasionally cavalier attitudes toward age of consent, the cultural differences of rural communities, or simply the unstoppable nature of his passions. Whether or not those arguments held water, the fact remained the controversy nearly destroyed him at his peak. A cautionary tale about how even rock stars have lines that, once crossed, bring dire consequences. He might have soared to the apex of early rock, but the tragedies in his personal life were never done with him. The death of two sons weighed heavily, with the teenage son's Jeep rollover recalling the family's history of losing children in violent ways. Wives vanished under suspicious or tragic circumstances. The unstoppable Jerry Lee found himself dancing with mortality more times than most of us can imagine. In that sense, it's not hard to understand his constant references to prayer and heaven, or his dread about the afterlife. He told interviewers time and again that he wondered if he had done too many wicked things in his life to be redeemed. And yet, for all his spiritual torment, Jerry Lee never truly left the stage. Even if he was blacklisted from certain venues or considered too hot to handle by certain promoters, he would pop up in any city that would have him, slamming down the keys and howling into the mic as though rock and roll were brand new again. Audiences who caught glimpses of him in his later years discovered that he still had that intangible spark, perhaps dimmed by age, but undeniably present. Some nights he'd channel his old mania, playing a country ballad one moment and then seamlessly transitioning into a rock anthem the next, flashing that grin that told you he was enjoying every minute of defying expectations. Hollywood, too, tried to capture his story. In 1989, a biopic called Great Balls of Fire starred Dennis Quaid as Jerry Lee, with Winona Ryder portraying Myra. The real Jerry Lee had plenty of criticisms about the portrayal, claiming it made him look too crude or too unhinged, though one might argue that there are few ways to accurately depict a man who did everything from firing guns in his bedroom to crashing cars at Graceland without crossing into the realm of wild exaggeration. If anyone knew how to be outraged, though, it was Jerry Lee. He had practically made a career out of blowing up expectations and rubbing establishment figures the wrong way. For those who worked alongside him, musicians like Eddie Kilroy, there was a persistent sense that Jerry Lee was forever running from something, possibly his own demons. He was that rare talent who could outplay just about any piano man around, but he seemed perpetually terrified of facing himself. Perhaps that fear contributed to the nonstop nature of his life, a swirl of precarious finances, rushed marriages, and hedonistic indulgence. Yet even in the middle of lawsuits and tax seizures, even when he was too intoxicated to think straight, that piano was always his sanctuary. By the time he reached his 80s, one might have imagined that Jerry Lee would settle into a calmer phase. He did to an extent, but he also continued to shock. The stroke he suffered in 2019 threatened to end the saga, robbing him of the ability to play the instrument that defined his entire existence. However, much like every other calamity he encountered, he simply refused to accept defeat. That partial recovery was hailed as a small miracle, giving him the chance to record gospel songs. Ironic, perhaps, that the same style of church-based music that once nearly exiled him from a religious school was now offering him comfort in his twilight years. All the while, a lingering puzzle remained. Jerry Lee Lewis had racked up multiple #1 hits on the country charts, and yet the Country Music Hall of Fame stayed conspicuously silent about inducting him. Fans argued that he deserved the same recognition there that he had received from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He himself occasionally voiced frustration about it, but then again, Jerry Lee was rarely short on frustration. He never lacked for a target to rail against, whether it was an unfair promoter or an entire institution that hadn't yet paid homage to his achievements. Late in his life, he mused that maybe his brand of rock and roll, which he always called the devil's music, was the reason that certain doors stayed closed to him. Some critics wrote him off as a relic of a past era. Others treated him as a living legend. Musicians and fans across genres, rock, country, blues, you name it, could trace a lineage back to him. It wasn't just the piano playing, but the attitude, the no-holds-barred showmanship, and that sense that anything could happen on stage. Even in a world that sometimes glorifies unpredictability, Jerry Lee was something else entirely. The original, the genuine article. As he aged, his mind sometimes flicked back to that flamboyant young rebel who recorded with Elvis, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins at Sun Studios, the images immortalized in the $1 Million Quartet photograph. He became the last surviving member of that informal group, watching from the vantage point of a battered survivor as the others passed into legend. That knowledge of being the last living link to the birth of rock brought a certain gravitas to his later interviews. In them, you'd sometimes hear a softer tone creeping into his voice, as though he were finally reckoning with the weight of it all. He'd talk about how, back in the day, they never imagined their music would still be revered generations down the line. They were just trying to eke out a living, have some fun, and maybe shake up the world a bit. Shake it up he did. If you think about the boundaries Jerry Lee broke, you realize it wasn't just about playing a piano with such force that it risked splintering. It was also about challenging a society that, at least on the surface, preached tidy moral values and a firm sense of decorum. He did it with his uncensored style, with shows that blurred lines between the sacred and the profane, and with personal decisions so taboo that they got him exiled from polite company. He was a fully realized contradiction, a deeply spiritual man who believed rock might be sinful, Yet he belted out hits that dripped with sin's allure. He seemed to crave acceptance, but also constantly acted out in ways guaranteed to push people away. He yearned for love, but kept sabotaging his own relationships with a mixture of jealousy, infidelity, and scorching temper. He sought stability, only to sabotage that as well with brandished guns and reckless driving. In reflecting on Jerry Lee's life, it's almost impossible to separate fact from legend. Did he really set his piano ablaze on stage because Chuck Berry was billed above him? Did he really drive into Elvis's gates with a pistol on the dash? In many cases, the answers are yes, though maybe the story has grown taller with each retelling. But that was precisely his allure. The sense that truth could be wilder than fiction, that some unstoppable force had taken human shape and marched across the American landscape for decades, leaving behind scorched stages, outraged moral guardians, battered finances, and an enduring legacy of rebellious music. He was reckless, yet enduring, scandalous, yet beloved. The Killer, as he was nicknamed, was said to have embraced the moniker from a bit of youthful slang with his buddies, but it also fit in a more metaphorical sense. He killed the old ways of playing piano, killed the idea that rock could be neat and polite, and sometimes nearly killed himself in the process. His complicated personality made him both a hero and a villain, depending on who was telling the story. But the music, that pounding, infectious, keyboard-driven explosion, remained a testament to his raw genius. His best songs still send shivers down the spine, reminding listeners that once upon a time, rock and roll was dangerous. He contributed the danger in ways that have seldom been replicated. That was the Jerry Lee Lewis who changed music forever, who merged boogie-woogie piano with the rebellious energy of rock, who refused to tone down his act to fit anybody's mold. The same wild streak that propelled him to greatness also dragged him through countless scandals and sorrows. In the end, his legacy is perhaps best seen as a mosaic of extremes: a pioneer who refused to bow, an artist who found redemption in music even as he courted damnation in life, a showman who cared more about giving the crowd an unforgettable experience than about preserving his own safety or dignity. He was and remains one of the most iconic figures in rock history, someone who carved his name into the story of American music with scorching intensity.